Welcome to another episode of the Silicon Dreams. This is your show host, RG Soniya, and joining me in the studio today, we have Anita. Anita, welcome to the Silicon Dreams on Radio Zindagi 1550 AM.
Great to be here, Sonia. As always, a pleasure.
Always a pleasure, and really great to have you here with us today, Anita, as we delve into your journey, and then through your journey we will explore the world of Web3 and AI and what's happening right now through your lenses, your perspectives. And I'm sure that our listeners who are tuning into the show today, they will get inspired. So again, Anita, welcome to the show, and why don't we just jump into it, and let's start by chatting about your origin story, as I would want to call it, right? Obviously, you were born and raised in India, and then you came from India to US. So why don't we go back to that era when you were going through that transition? And why don't you start by telling our audiences here, where did your journey begin from? In India, how did your career begin, and what made you transition to the States?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm probably going to be revealing my age in the process of, going back. Again, first of all, pleasure to be here, Sonia. Always exciting. I really started my career just around the dot-com time when I graduated from college. I'm originally from Hyderabad, India, born and raised. And I went straight into a couple of tech companies. I guess now we call them tech companies, but it used to be software at that time. This is just about when digital was taking off. So I worked for a company called IntelliGroup, which was by then already a NASDAQ listed firm, basically doing large scale implementations with ERP software solutions, and with customers globally. So I was part of this very unique experiment the founders did called establishing a business development center. And actually, in hindsight, when I look back, I think that's one of the first really interesting distributed remote work model, where instead of using Indian talent for back office operations and then customer service, that obviously, was really big part of the outsourcing BPO movement that happened, they'd actually used that similar infrastructure to drive a 24-hour corporate office structure that was based out of Edison, New Jersey. So we had two teams with basically two different counterparts, a distributed team, back like in 97, 98.
You're really giving your age away.
Oh, totally, totally. I'm totally fine with that too, by the way. And effectively, kind of really showcasing that, hey, it is not just for the back office, not a cost arbitrage, but you can actually apply that for talent that can do every function of an organization. So I was part of the 60-person team that was recruited from all over India, and we were part of establishing those functions in Hyderabad. So that's how we really got started.
Absolutely. By the way, I love the perspective that you're sharing, right? Because a lot of people look at offshore teams as just a not necessarily liability, but as you said, right, a cost center where you have some work, you're getting it done cheaper. But in reality, as you said, when you really dive into the details, and especially if you have good leadership on both sides, right, the on-site as well as offshore counterparts, you can establish what you call a global 24/7 working environment, and that obviously is going to give a good boost to the productivity. And then it's no longer a function of just offsetting your costs, but it's also a function of being more productive, going to market quicker, and delivering faster. Because ever since the 90s,
and most importantly, it is you were selling 24/7.
Yes.
So means a corporate function, no matter where in the world, even today, is not seen as a 24/7 function. Means you're actually doing sales 24/7. You're running HR 24/7. You're running operations 24/7. So that's why it's one of the very early models that luckily I was part of it and helping build some part of it, was this distributed team structure. Now post-COVID, we talk about remote work and distributed teams, same talent. The talent is not lower or higher. So there's natural cost advantage, but of course, this fast tracks you against your competition. Also, you do sales, revenue generation significantly.
Absolutely. And today we obviously know about giants like Microsoft, Google, Facebook, who have such global operations centers. But back in 90s, except for Microsoft, Google was still on paper, right? It was being born, right? We had Larry Page and Sergey Brin, the brilliant PhD students working under Rajiv Motwani then, and then Facebook was not even around. Facebook came much later.
Much later,
Yes,
much
90s,
later.
90s was gone
Yeah.
when Facebook came
But this
into
was,
the
what's
equation.
interesting, this was just at the cusp of
The
internet
breakout.
and then the breakout of the internet.
Yeah.
And, you had like SAP, Oracle implementations, PeopleSoft, Barn, like all of these
Java,
companies.
everything.
And then we had this other practice called Other and Digital Practice. That was the very first intro to digital solutions that new players were coming about. Anyway, so I worked there for some time and then left to actually truly join as an early employee, I think 25, fifth employee of a software startup, an enterprise software startup called SizeSphere at that time. Later, of course, had many iterations and then went on to become Party Gaming when it went public on London Stock Exchange, I think in the mid-2000s,
Wow,
for close to a $9 billion valuation.
That must have been a great journey because 9 billion at that time, adjusted for inflation, is 20 billion plus at least, right?
I mean, this is when just Facebook was probably like a baby. Let's put it that way, right?
Yes, because I'm just thinking about the stock market crash, and that was in 2008, and that crash is equal to like $1 trillion crash right now, and that was 650 billion. So just, I mean, obviously, I'm not the best with numbers, so I have to admit that.
But regardless of that, I think for me, what was interesting about that is, in Asian countries and, rest of the non-Western countries, this concept of a startup is almost building from scratch, idea to manifestation of an IPO is not a known thing. It used to be part of a conglomerate or like some spin-off.
You already had to have money to make more money.
Correct. Of course, that's why like Infosys kind of became like set a different league. So this was one of those where...
It became one of our poster babies.
Correct. But this was prior to that, right? So a company literally with an idea, finding a market here. Another Indian founder who used to work here at Bell Labs came back to India and started that. So I was doing product development as part of the early employee. Effectively we enabled when everyone's trying to create a search engine to build Amazon online, we enabled brick-and-mortar casinos to go online for the first time.
Oh, wow. Right. So you have been... I don't know if even Malta licenses, etc., were around then. I have absolutely no idea. I think I was still in high school in late 90s, and I can't remember if I knew about the concept of online casinos also, right? I was just barely getting into the internet. Thankfully, our school had access to it. Now, with that being said, obviously, just within India, Anita, you have been truly blessed, right? And also, it's also your hard work that you have been exposed to such good opportunities while you were in India. Because we're talking about 90s, early 2000s, where things were just coming up. The word startup was also not known to the general Indian populace. Today, with shows like Shark Tank, etc., it has become a household word. But that time, if you went and asked somebody about a startup, they would probably think it has got something to do with an engine or something. I don't know. I mean, definitely not
startup was not. People will use words like business, but never startup.
Startup, exactly.
So it's an entirely different connotation. So.
Absolutely, right. And there are also some subtle differences. So there's that too. Now, when did you come to the US? And before we even get to that, you did talk about your origin story. Like, you started as a technologist, you built these large-scale systems, then you moved into product. And I want to continue that journey, but even just before that, I would like to ask you today, right, just so that our listeners understand where you're at, what is your role today? What do you do today?
I mean, I continue to be on the technology side of the equation, which is very exciting. Obviously, it never goes out of fashion in that sense. I advise and mentor tech startups in multiple technologies. Particularly, my current focus is in AI, of course, for quite some time, and then biotech, life sciences biotech, which is now becoming fast tech bio as an entirely new category. And then, of course, Web3, you can call it. Web3 came about later, but I think when I first started dabbling in it, it was just Bitcoin, crypto, blockchain, technology again. So these are the three kind of broad direct areas that I'm, play, a couple of different roles. And I'm part of another ecosystem called Alpine Ventures, And Iona as a technology where it's kind of heavily focusing on enterprise AI, and then how AI can be applied in a variety of different problem areas across enterprise sectors.
Amazing. And Anita, along with being an advisor to startups, as well as you said, you're still a builder yourself, you also invest in startups or help startups raise funds, right?
Yes.
So you are doing a lot. Now let's quickly go back to the time when you made your transition from India to US. What prompted it? Where did you come to? What was the journey like? Give us all the details.
I think coming to the US was more a personal thing, which is I had met this man who I got to know him, and we decided to get married. And I was still working with that startup that I mentioned to you at the time, and he used to be based in Atlanta, and then we decided to get married. So the decision was like, who's going to move where? So the fact that I was already involved in, at that point, 3 different founders who all have strong roots to the US sector, particularly in technology and building things here. So it just seems like a natural fit.
Transition for
me to move here. I mean, of course, hindsight, if I had not moved, India was just about to take off in a massive way too. So, both ways is kind of really interesting where, you don't know which path would have led to what. But the interesting part is when I came here, I came straight into the dot-com bust.
Right.
Literally.
Yeah. And obviously India was impacted by that, but the US was impacted in a huge
particularly on the tech
way.
side of the equation, right?
Exactly. And the tech side and also the financial side, because the Wall Street was going down
Not
because
as much
of the startups failing, right?
But
Big
not as
valuations going down.
significantly as the 2008 crisis did to financial markets, right?
Right.
So much lower. But the fact is, if you came from that sector, I was still early on, straight out of college,
Yeah,
still a few years.
I keep forgetting that back in 90s when the dot-com burst actually happened, Google, Apple, Facebook,
they all came out of it.
They came out of it, but also at that time the tech companies were not the ones that owned 50% of the S&P 500 or the value. It was financial institutions, the larger companies, manufacturing, and software in those days was always a means to support these systems and not necessarily a product by itself.
Correct. It's not like technology was providing services. Technology was augmenting how you provide services.
Yes, absolutely. And technology by itself wasn't a product that people were going and actively consuming.
Correct.
That changed much later. Yeah, that is interesting, right? Like how the market dynamics has changed. Today when we talk about FANG, FANG, that literally each of the FANG company is almost $1 trillion company, except for Facebook getting there, right?
Correct. Nvidia is there, which is not included at that time.
Yes.
So
it's not. Netflix. Maybe the N can be swapped out for Nvidia now.
Pretty much.
We just keep the FANG as is. But if you think about it, the FANG literally all of the $1 trillion plus companies are actually a tech company, right? They're no longer the manufacturing company and so on. But so when you came to US, what was your transition like?
I mean, the first year when I came, it was kind of different, right? The environment here was very different, and I'm not an engineer or a scientist. So being a non-engineer and scientist is much harder to justify your skills or your experience that can be understood on the United States side of the equation. Particularly, I was on the southeast, northeast, zone, which is very different than California. And so I was waiting for my work permit. While I was doing it, the market was bad. Even though I thought I did a lot of amazing things by then, it was not understood that easily or translated because there's just no reference point for companies here to understand what you did and then translate that back into the roles they were looking for. And the justification is obviously harder to recruit folks in non-tech environments.
And to be very honest, I think a lot of our listeners would probably relate to what we're talking about because a lot of us have gone through the pains of immigration. And we know that even visas at that time, like H-1B, today it's a blessing that spousal visas, H-4, get EADs and people can work. But I have seen families tear apart because one of the spouses could not work, right? And you just can't sit at home. And even earlier, even today, you have to justify your skill sets for getting an H-1B visa.
Correct.
Because H-1B visa is a specialty visa. It's
Correct.
not just a work visa, it's a work visa for a specialty occupation. So
And also with that one firm. So you really can't move around.
You
So there
can't
are
move
a
around.
lot of
You're
restrictions.
stuck. You know,
Yeah,
it's
correct.
it's a very modern prison. That's how I
Yeah,
look at
yeah.
it. Because you don't even have the flexibility of working on your own idea. It is that bad. Like, especially if you're trying to monetize that idea. Which, if you're back in India, yes, there are IP conflicts, but as long as you're not using a company's infrastructure, etc., you're just doing it on your personal time and on your personal devices. You can own the IP that you create, but it's not the same here. I mean, you can own the IP, but
however,
monetizing it
having
is a different
said that,
thing.
though, this is where, I guess anyone who's been involved or drawn towards startup kind of environments, it's not
find a way.
They'll find a way.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
this is where you begin to also discover who you are in terms of like what's your normal leaning, whether you thrive in a very abstract, entrepreneurial, fluid environment, or you thrive really in a very structured environment.
A
So,
well-established corporate company.
so again, great talent everywhere, but they operate differently, and there's a natural positioning that people have. And I was obviously fast discovering by then that almost everything I'd done by that time was super early, very early employee, fluid, startup. Doesn't matter big company or small. It was always like building something from scratch. And so while that was happening, it's another opportunity to really truly learn an entirely new country and how things operate. And I started getting involved in some really interesting organizations in Atlanta. And one particular organization was the Atlanta Symphony Orchestra. So I joined
That's
their
interesting.
corporate fundraising team
Oh, wow.
and okay, music was amazing. So, I was just happy that I was getting season passes to attend every single concert. They had actually put together one of the top symphonies in the country, and got a chance to almost learn deeply classical music, Western classical music in the donor environment, and then in the entire industry, right? Again, you just pivoted exploration, right? You're constantly exploring, learning new things.
And you also got into fundraising, because before that, what I heard was even your roles at the startup in India, they were focused on product development, right? And now you got into fundraising, and as we know, that journey has continued even till date, right? You are still a very active participant of the Silicon Valley investor network. You invest in startups. You are working with companies like Republic and other venture groups as a venture partner yourself. So, as you said, right, wherever you have an appetite to learn, there are a lot of things out there. You need to go and grab them.
Correct. Because, normally it takes time. Again, if you're in California, it's a different kind of recruiting environment. East Coast is very, very, very different.
You came to Atlanta.
Right? So Atlanta, the South and the Southeast is not the same. And that's when you also begin to understand the broader landscape of the United States is not one culture, one method.
Absolutely.
This is like 50 different countries rolled into one in terms of how things operate. So it's you begin to that's why at the end of the day, it doesn't matter where you are, you're learning a new environment and beginning to learn how to operate within a new environment.
Absolutely. And then, Anita, when did you transition? So, by the way, you lived in Atlanta for a decade, as I know, right? So what did that decade look like? As we know, when you came to Atlanta, we actually got into the .com burst right then. So 10 years later, when you were getting out of Atlanta, we were going through the financial meltdown.
Correct.
So it was an interesting period, right? But then between that, there was still a huge growth that happened. So what happened in that journey? What was happening, especially in the technology landscape?
I actually left
too?
the direct tech and went into finance for several years in between. So my first break really in this country I got was with GE Capital. So... And it was fantastic.
So the symphony experience with fundraising helped there, I guess, right?
No correlation
nothing.
whatsoever to... this is more, I was part of the risk management team.
Okay.
There's a group under GE Capital called Commercial Finance, where this particular entity, GE was massive conglomerate and financial services was huge, one of the top players in the world. And commercial finance, we were looking at across the board, lending and leasing, commercial financing of value chains, supply chains, different products. And there is a particular a subgroup under that called commercial distribution finance that I was part of. I was recruited into that company, but I was not based. The role was not based in Atlanta. It was actually based in Tampa. So I was part of a defense, like risk management is about, hey, when you own a lot of that things that you actually finance and product, till the customer pays back, you own that product. It's your product on your books, so you have to safeguard. So risk management is a very well-oiled function where you look at a lot of different metrics. So as part of the first line of defense, we had field auditors. I was one of the field auditors at about 150, 200 customers in my territory, and that was southern Georgia and then central Florida was my territory. So I was based physically living in Atlanta. Home was Atlanta, but then Tampa was my second home. And basically I was covering that whole whatever territory.
Yeah.
But it was just pure, there's no tech. It's purely financial services, where literally it's a $15 billion portfolio under GE Capital that I was involved with. And I had many amazing opportunities when I was with GE Capital. Very quickly, 6 months later, I was invited to join their leadership program as a Six Sigma Black Belt. I was involved with the post-integration effort when GE acquired their number one competition. So I did a lot of different things within GE.
But also, I know you call it a pure financial structure. You're working on risk management, and today I know you advise startups, and risk management is a big part of that too, especially when you're scouting startups, and also when startups are planning to use their funds for certain things, right? A lot of the times there are so many people who even plan to look for the risks and have risk mitigation strategies in place, right?
Yep.
I've seen you advise startups, mentor some startups when we worked together for the Tim Draper show, right? So I've seen you work, and now it actually comes back to me, where are you getting all your experience from? Well, it's from all of these journeys that you've been in your life.
But more than the risk side, I think something that really interesting is when you understand the flow of money and then how money bets and how money assesses risk. It's an entirely different things. In this case, you're looking at how are you financing the value chain. Means to say, Harley Davidson was a customer, almost many recreational vehicle companies were customers, marinas were customers. So we had exclusivity to finance the manufacturer, the distributor, the dealer. Means we knew end to end how that industry works, inside out, because we look at the numbers, right? We know how the money flows, what the margins are, all of that stuff. So it's a entirely different thing to understand, and how do you automate. So data was my first introduction there on how you start automating things.
How data actually lies into. Well, Anita, I wish we had more time to continue our conversations. We definitely need a follow-up. But just before we leave, because I do want to do another segment where we could actually dive into what you're doing right now. And hopefully we can have that follow-up segment in the next couple of weeks itself. But that being said, just before we wrap up this show, I would love for you to give probably one or two, or one solid piece of advice to any builders who are listening to this show, right? Your role is that of an advisor. You're looking at the trends today. If there are people who are thinking, and I'll make the question a little specific, right? If there are people who are thinking about building their own startup in the next couple of years and they're looking for ideas, what is one advice you'd give to them? What areas they should look at?
I don't think there's any such thing as idea anymore, because the moment you think it's an idea, AI probably would have automated, and then the environment that we're in. So if you truly are building, then you really want to think, don't build forward, build backwards. Which is what I mean by that is, whatever you're doing, a machine will replace you. Doesn't matter, right? I mean, it's massively fast growth, accelerating at a pace that it's impossible to even grasp. So if you're building something, even as a solution or a problem that I identified, the idea that you're implementing, ensure that the method and how we are using, of course, don't do without AI. Makes no sense anymore, right? AI is not just in predictive analytics, full on.
AI, integrate AI in your pipeline.
Think intelligence first, right? If you're not building on top of intelligence, you're actually already obsolete.
Absolutely. Plus even the time to market, right?
Time to market is very hard to control right now. Means 2 years from now, everything that you thought is real is no longer going to be reality. So if you can't anticipate and you can not sustain for the next 2 years, you have no chance to even get there. So that's why build backwards, understand that there will be a version of AI that's going to replace exactly what you're trying to do, even your solution. Then how do you sustain and how do you build your moats and defensibility? As part of that, you almost have to be very deliberate in that process of
Got
integration.
it. Well, thank you again, Anita, for joining us, and we will have you back on the show in a couple of weeks. And for the listeners, again, the one last piece of advice, right, coming from Anita, don't build forward, build backwards, right? And again, Anita, thank you very much for joining us today on the show on the Silicon Dreams on Radio Zindagi 1550 AM. And to all our listeners, we'll see you next Monday. Until then, Jia.